I'm Derek Maselli, and this is Politalks. I have Laura Gomez on the phone with me right now. She's a professor of law and sociology, as well as Chicano studies at the University of California in Los Angeles. Also author of a book called Manifest Destinies, The Making of the Mexican-American Race. Happy to have you on the line today, Laura.
Great to be here, Derek. Thank you.
Now, today we'll be taking a look at some recent rhetoric possibly used by President Donald Trump during a meeting last week where he rejected a deal on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DREAMers program, as we more casually like to call it. The president allegedly used the term, and I am going to beep this, hole, to describe some countries. Now, you're saying that given Trump's campaign rhetoric and platform, this kind of language, though Trump denies it, shouldn't really be a surprise to anyone, correct?
That is exactly right. This is, we could start the clock from when he started campaigning and talk about his refusal to disavow, for example, endorsements by David Duke, formerly of the KKK. We could talk about his calling Mexicans rapists and drug dealers, or we could just look at the policies that he's enacted since he's become president and his statements since he's become president. The Muslim travel ban and backing away from the DREAMers and telling police officers in New Jersey that they should be rough with arrestees. We could look at any number of these things and tease out perhaps the sentiment that was expressed in the meeting, according to some of those who were there on Thursday. But it's pretty clear that Trump is not a fan of people of color and not a fan of immigrants, and certainly has been willing to play to his base. To charge up those white nationalists and others who believe that we've got too many immigrants in this country and too many immigrants of a certain kind, not immigrants from Norway, as it were.
Yeah, and so following up on that, then we can reasonably assume that at this point that at least some of Donald Trump's presidential campaign success did stem from members of the majority population, in this case white Americans, feeling threatened by rapidly growing minority populations, with a particular focus on immigrants from Mexico, and I think we can also say the Middle East. So how does that campaign, its promises, and its language impact the current immigration reform debate?
Well, it's very interesting because there are a couple of things that are happening right now. One is certainly the status of the DREAMers, who are these young people and children who are undocumented, but who came to the United States without documents as under their parents' guidance. They didn't choose to enter the country without documents and violate American laws, right? They were brought by their parents. Here at the University of California, Los Angeles, we've got some 750 DACA students in the entire university. I had a student in my class last semester who was a DACA student, and the terror that these young people are experiencing, not knowing from one day to the next what's going to happen, is really unconscionable. And I think we will look back on this moment and we will really be looking at what side were you on. It will be one of those moments where we say, did you do the right thing at that moment? And also, I mean, if it's okay that I continue, the Republican Party is almost by definition, with the actions of Trump and if there is a refusal to negotiate on the DREAMers and to come to a policy, the Republicans are really saying, we are willing to let the Hispanic vote go. We're not gonna fight for it. And demographically, that's going to mean for the Democratic Party nationally what it's meant in California for the last 20 years, which is that no Republican can get elected to statewide office.
I guess now that we've established current context for all of this, surely we can look back and we can acknowledge there was a time when, say, Italian, Irish, Jewish immigrants all faced hostility as well, but over time they were seemingly, for the most part, adopted into the majority demographic of white American. Why would the situation with Latinos be any different?
Yeah, that is a great question, Derek. And it's really what Manifest Destinies is about. Because I take this moment in time when the U.S. invaded Mexico in 1846, and at the end of that war, 2 years later, the result was the incorporation of all of the Southwest and Mountain West, all the way as far north as Wyoming and Utah, and the U.S. took half of Mexico's territory at the end of that war as a surrender. Now, what's interesting about the comparison, in my view, about the comparison to other kinds of populations, in particular the Irish Americans, Italian immigrants, Jewish immigrants, is that within a matter of 1 or 2 decades, those folks became accepted into the broader white population. Mm-hmm. Not without significant hostility and racism at the time, early on, right?
Right.
And a lot of that was very local, right? It really varied by where you were and what were the dynamics. But Mexican Americans have been, my family, I can trace one branch of my 4 grandparents back to people who lived in New Mexico, which is my home state, when it was Mexico. Now, I'm not saying that's all of my ancestors. I have more recent immigration in my background from Mexico as well. But that's a long time that Mexican Americans haven't been incorporated as white. Now, I will also tell you, Derek, that there's some complexity on this question. So, for example, you probably know Michigan has a significant Mexican-American population, mm-hmm. and it's not just contemporary immigrants, right? There was a Mexican town in Detroit as early as the 1920s, and some of those Mexican Americans who lived there in Michigan at that time worked very hard to try to blend into the white group in order to avoid being treated like African Americans, right? It was very clear which side of the color line you wanted to be on, mm-hmm. not necessarily where you ended up. And I guess what I would say is right now, given the immigration from Asia and Latin America since 1965 and how dramatically that's changed the U.S. demographics, and then coupled with Trump's rhetoric throughout the campaign and continuing as he has been president, Mexican Americans and other Hispanics in this country very much feel and know, we know we're on the other side of the white, non-white ledger. We know we're on the non-white side. Think about Puerto Ricans, right? And mm-hmm. what Puerto Ricans have gone through in terms of Hurricane Maria. And Trump's, I can't get that image out of my head of Trump throwing the paper towel rolls at hurricane victims and say, hey, everything's fine here, fun, fun, fun. And meanwhile, we still, more than 100 days later, we still don't have electricity out to half of the people on the island. And this is an American island. I mean, this is just shocking. Americans should be as shocked as we were with the response to Hurricane Katrina, and this is happening even after we thought we'd learned from Hurricane Katrina.
So moving up then to the national scale of things, and we've got an interesting situation where in regards to Latin Americans at the national level federally, I mean, we've got white, black, Asian, Native American, or American Indian, or Pacific Islander races. Qualifier for, I guess you would say, Latin Americans being this Hispanic ethnicity. Not so much an actual race, though. So what are the implications, potentially, of identifying individuals or lineages hailing from Latin America as ethnically Hispanic, which, in theory, has that European root connection, but not racially?
Yeah, that is such an important question, and it's really timely, Derek, because the census is deciding right now whether or not to continue that designation of quote-unquote Hispanic Latino ethnicity, unquote, of whether or not that's going to appear again in the 2020 census. And there's, I think, if I had to put money on it, I would say that the census will be moving toward treating Hispanics and Latinos as a racial category. So in other words, instead of having that separate question that says, are you Hispanic or Latino? Mm-hmm. If so, from, what country of origin do your people arise? There would just be Hispanic or Latino folded into the race question.
Okay, so...
And the reason that I think... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
The reason I think this is important is because Latinos and Hispanics are experiencing a great deal of racism in the age of Trump. And significant numbers of Latinos, especially Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, who together make up 80% of all Hispanics in the United States, they don't want to identify as white. They don't want to identify as black. They don't want to identify as Native American. They don't want to identify as Asian in terms of the race question. And so we're losing some of them. And upwards of 45% of Mexican Americans and 45% of Puerto Ricans say they are, quote, some other race. And so we're starting to see a real rejection of the sort of notion that, well, Hispanics can be Hispanic and they can be white, which was historically, that was one of the ways, as I mentioned earlier, that Hispanics wanted to distinguish themselves from African Americans in particular. Although, what the argument that I was making before is that never really worked, right? Never mm-hmm. really worked to avoid the discrimination and so forth.
We are running up on time here now, but lastly, I do want to ask you, it sounds as if you're advocating or in favor of formal recognition of a Latino racial group, but the question to me then becomes, given the diversity even amongst Mexico, Central, South America, is there really enough commonality among, say, Brazilian Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, Costa Rican Americans, to justify putting all of those different Latin American subgroups into a single Latino racial category?
That is a great question. Now, so what I will tell you is the idea of Latinos as a racial category. That only works in the United States. In other words, you can't talk about Latinos in Brazil. That's meaningless, right? It means something in our country at the present moment, and it has meant something historically because society has not responded to Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, despite their long history in the United States, by incorporating them into the white group, as they have with Irish Americans and Italian Americans, for example. And so in that context, Hispanics are more and more seeing themselves as united. Now, that's not to say that there isn't very substantial and important racial variation among Hispanics in the United States. So, for example, Dominicans and Puerto Ricans, there are significant numbers of people in those groups who think of themselves as Afro-Latinos and who others might identify as black. And there are Latinos in the Southwest, including some immigrants from Central America and Mexico who are indigenous, right? And so I'm not saying that those aren't realities as well. But I'm saying that in this current moment when hatred has been unleashed and endorsed by the leader of the free world, in that moment there has been kind of a racial consciousness raising that has gone on. And so I think that the census is behind. If we don't make that change to how people can self-identify, we're missing out on that dynamic.
Okay, well, thank you, Laura, for taking some time to chat with us today.
Thanks, Derek. That was terrific.
Again, that's Laura Gomez, University of California professor and author of Manifest Destinies. I hope you all enjoyed our talk today. Once again, I'm Derek Maselli, and this is Politalks. Maselli, and this is Politalks. Maselli, and this